My daughter and her husband lived in my house for 4 years. They received $80 million from my late husband, and I got an old garage. That same day, she kicked me out. Get out! We're rich now! But in the garage, I found a second real will, which stated that this was, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Martha Collins, and I am 68 years old. For 43 years, I lived in the same white house on Clover Street in Dayton, Ohio. The house where I raised my daughter Diane, where I planted rose bushes along the front fence, where my husband Gerald and I drank coffee every morning on the back porch watching the birds. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 3-bedroom house with creaky floors and a drafty garage that Gerald always meant to fix. But it was mine. It was ours. And I loved it the way you can only love a place that holds your whole life inside its walls. Gerald was a good man, a quiet man. He worked 30 years as a civil engineer, saved carefully, invested wisely, and never talked about money at the dinner table because he said money was a tool, not a personality. When he died of a heart attack in March of last year, standing at the kitchen sink, washing his coffee mug just like any ordinary Tuesday, I felt the floor go out from under me. We had been married 45 years. I didn't know how to be a person without him. Diane and her husband Trent moved in 6 weeks after the funeral. She said it was to help me. She said I shouldn't be alone in a big house. She brought casseroles and spoke softly and held my hand at the kitchen table while I cried. I was grateful. I was foolish. Looking back now, I can see exactly when the help stopped being help and started being something else entirely. But grief does something to your eyes. It blurs the edges of things. The first sign came about 3 months in. I noticed that Trent had started going through Gerald's desk in the study. Not casually, methodically. Folders pulled out, replaced, stacked differently. I asked him once what he was looking for. He smiled that wide smile of his and said he was just getting organized, helping out. I didn't push. I should have. The second sign came when Diane began taking calls in the bedroom with the door closed. She'd done that before. She was a private person, I told myself. But these calls happened late at night, and once, passing the hallway, I heard the word attorney. And then her voice dropped so low I couldn't catch another syllable. When she came out, she looked at me with a bright, practiced smile. "Just work stuff, Mom." I nodded and went back to my room. The third sign, the one I should have screamed at, was when I found the study locked. My own study, in my own house, with a new padlock on the door. Trent said he'd put it there to protect Gerald's papers from getting mixed up while they helped me sort through the estate. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, staring at that padlock, and felt something cold move through my chest. But I told myself, he means well. Diane means well. They are trying to help. I was wrong about that. The call from the attorney's office came on a Thursday morning in October. A man named Mr. Hale introduced himself as the executor of Gerald's estate. He told me in a careful, neutral voice that a will had been filed with the probate court. He asked if I had been informed of its contents. I said I assumed it was what Gerald and I had always discussed. The house to me. Savings split between me and Diane. There was a pause on the line, a pause that lasted just half a second too long. He said he would send the documents over. I read them at the kitchen table while Diane sat across from me, watching. The will, signed, notarized, dated 8 months before Gerald's death, left everything to Diane. The savings account, the investment portfolio, the life insurance payout. $80 million accumulated over a lifetime of careful, quiet work. And to me, the document listed in plain language the detached garage and its contents. I looked up at my daughter. She was already smiling. "Mom," she said, and her voice had changed. The softness was gone. It was flat now, certain. "Trent and I have been talking. This is our house now. We're going to need the space. She glanced toward the door. You should probably start thinking about where you want to go. I sat very still. Outside, a car passed on Clover Street. The rose bushes I had planted 20 years ago moved in the October wind against the window. Get out, she said, when I didn't move. We're rich now, Mom. We don't need to pretend anymore. I was 68 years old, sitting in my own kitchen, being told to leave my own home by my own daughter. And in that moment, something happened inside me that I did not expect. I did not cry. I spent that first night in the garage. Not because I had nowhere to go. I had a sister in Columbus, a friend 3 streets over. But I didn't call anyone. I sat in the cold garage on a folding chair Gerald used for fishing trips, wrapped in an old army blanket I found on a shelf, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Sometimes you have to sit inside the worst moment before you can start moving through it. The garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust and, faintly, like Gerald's work gloves. He'd spent a lot of time out here. Tools hung on pegboards, labeled in his neat handwriting. Mason jars of bolts, sorted by size. A workbench he'd built himself in 1987. This was his thinking space, he used to say. When a problem was too big for the kitchen table, he brought it to the garage. I looked around in the yellow light of a single bulb and thought, $80 million. Gone. My house. Gone. My daughter. The one I had sat with through chicken pox and broken hearts and a miscarriage she didn't tell her father about, the one I had driven to ballet and chemistry tutoring and college orientation. That daughter had looked me in the eye and told me to get out. How does a person process that? I didn't sleep. I made a mental list instead, the way Gerald taught me. He always said, when you don't know what to do, write down what you know. So I sat in the cold and I listed facts. Fact: a will had been filed that I had never seen before. Fact: Gerald and I had discussed our estate plan many times, and it looked nothing like what was in that document. Fact: Diane and Trent had been in Gerald's study for months with a lock on the door. Fact: the signature on the will was Gerald's, or appeared to be. And then I asked myself the question that changed everything. When exactly did Gerald sign that document? The will was dated 8 months before his death. 8 months before he died, Gerald had been healthy. Gardening, playing chess with our neighbor Bill on Saturday mornings. He had no reason to rewrite his will in secret, cut me out of everything we'd built together, and say nothing to me about it. We talked about everything. We argued sometimes the way married people do. About money, about Diane, about small things and large ones. But secrets? Gerald didn't keep secrets from me. Someone had kept one for him. I stood up from the folding chair. My knees ached from the cold. I walked to Gerald's workbench and ran my hand along the edge of it, the way I used to touch his shoulder when he was working. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, or hadn't looked at properly. On the underside of the bench's top shelf, where Gerald stored his most important small items in an old wooden box, the box was pushed further back than usual. Pushed, or hidden. I pulled it out. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside, under a layer of hardware receipts and an old fishing license, was a manila envelope. Sealed. My name written on it in Gerald's handwriting. Not typed, not printed. Written in blue ink in his careful, slightly tilted letters. Martha. For you. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. It was a will. A second will, dated 4 months after the one filed in probate. So 4 months before Gerald died. It was handwritten on 3 pages, signed, and notarized by a woman named Patricia Owens at a UPS store on the other side of town. Not the family attorney. A different notary entirely. I read it twice in the garage light. Gerald had left me the house. full ownership. He had left me half the savings and a letter of instruction for the investment accounts. He had left Diane a fair and generous inheritance, $3 million and his mother's jewelry. He had written, in a note at the bottom of the last page, in his own words, "I'm leaving this here because I don't trust the situation at home right now. If you're reading this, Martha, something went wrong. Get an attorney. Don't let them tell you this doesn't exist." I sat back down on the fishing chair. Gerald had known. He had suspected something, and he had been careful, and he had tried to protect me even from beyond whatever he feared was coming. The fear I'd been holding in my chest since Thursday morning didn't disappear. But underneath it, something else appeared. Something that felt, if I'm honest, like it had Gerald's name on it. I folded the envelope carefully, tucked it inside my coat against my body, and took out my phone. It was 4:47 in the morning. I found the number for Ohio Legal Aid, wrote it in my notes for morning, and then I found the number for a probate litigation attorney I'd seen mentioned in a community newsletter months ago. A woman named Carol Vance, who had a reputation, the newsletter said, for taking on fraud cases. I would call her when the sun came up. I was 68 years old, alone in a cold garage with everything taken from me. And I had a plan. Carol Vance's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. The kind of office that told you she spent money on her work, not her furniture. She was 50-something, compact. With short gray hair and reading glasses, she kept pushing up her nose. She did not offer me coffee. She opened a yellow legal pad and looked at me across the desk and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning, and don't decide for me what's important." I did. I told her about Gerald, the death, the 6 weeks before Diane moved in. I told her about the locked study, the late phone calls, the document filed in probate. Then I set the manila envelope on her desk. She read the second will carefully. She examined the notarization. She flipped to the last page and read Gerald's handwritten note twice. Then she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "do you understand what you're holding?" I said I thought I did. If this document is authentic, and the notary stamp and Gerald's signature will need to be verified, then someone filed a fraudulent will in an Ohio probate court. That is not a civil matter. That is a crime. She paused. A serious one. She agreed to take the case. We spent 2 hours going through everything I remembered. She explained the process. First, a forensic handwriting analyst would need to examine both wills. Second, she would contact Patricia Owens, the notary on the second will, to verify the signing. Third, she would file a formal objection to the probate proceeding, a will contest, which would legally freeze the distribution of the estate while the court investigated. "They'll know," I said. "When you file, Diane and Trent will know I'm fighting this." "Yes," Carol said, "they will. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the garage, the cold chair, Gerald's handwriting on that envelope. "I am," I said. What I didn't know, what I found out later, was that Diane had already noticed I was gone. Not gone the way she'd intended, meekly disappearing to a sister's guest room. Gone quietly. No calls, no pleading, no tears on the doorstep. Trent had apparently expected me to come back and beg. When I didn't, when the house stayed silent, and I didn't answer Diane's single text message, "Mom, where are you? We should talk." They started to worry. My neighbor Bill Garrett told me afterward that he'd seen Trent standing on the front porch 2 days after I left, looking up and down Clover Street with a specific kind of alertness that Bill described as like a man who lost something and wasn't sure if someone else had found it. Bill was 71, retired, and possessed of the sharp observational patience of someone who had spent 40 years as a high school principal. He didn't wave at Trent. He watched him. Meanwhile, Carol's investigator, A former county clerk named Ray Dutton, who did document work on the side, located Patricia Owens within 48 hours. Mrs. Owens, it turned out, remembered the signing perfectly. She was in her 60s, ran a small notary business out of the UPS store, and kept meticulous records. She had Gerald's ID photocopy, the date, the time. 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. And she remembered Gerald specifically because he'd come in alone, asked for a glass of water, and sat for a moment before signing. He seemed like he was carrying something heavy, she told Ray. I asked if he was all right. He said yes. He just wanted to make sure he did this right. She had a carbon copy of every page. The forensic analyst, a woman out of Cincinnati named Dr. Sandra Bell, who testified in court cases, examined both documents. Her preliminary finding arrived in Carol's email 10 days after our first meeting. I read it sitting in Carol's office. The signature on document A, the will filed in probate, shows inconsistencies with known exemplars of the subject's handwriting, including variation in baseline pressure, letter formation in the surname, and pen lift patterns. The signature on document B, the handwritten will, is consistent with all available exemplars. It is my preliminary opinion that document A warrants further forensic examination for potential forgery. There it was. I sat with that word, forgery, and let it settle. My daughter had forged her father's will, or someone had forged it for her. Either way, she had known. She had let me sit at that kitchen table and read a document that was almost certainly fake. She had told me to leave my own house. She had looked at me, her mother, the woman who held her hand through every hard thing life had given her. And she had lied. Carol filed the will contest that afternoon. The probate court issued a freeze on the estate. Gerald's accounts, all of them, were locked pending investigation. That evening, my phone rang. Diane's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times before midnight. The point of no return had been crossed. Not by me. I understood now that it had been crossed long before I ever found that envelope in the garage. I was simply the last one to arrive at the truth. But I had arrived. Carol had warned me they would escalate. People who've committed fraud don't sit quietly when they're caught, she said. Expect pressure. Expect it to be ugly. She was right on both counts. 3 days after the probate freeze, Diane called from a number I didn't recognize, presumably so I'd pick up. I did. I didn't speak first. I waited. Mom. Her voice was different from the flat, certain tone she'd used in the kitchen. This was something more controlled, careful. I think there's been a misunderstanding about Dad's will. Trent and we want to explain. Can we meet? Everything goes through my attorney, I said. Her name is Carol Vance. I'll give you the number. Silence. Mom, you're making a mistake. A shift in tone now, colder. Dad signed that will himself. You know that. You're confused because you're grieving and some lawyer is taking advantage of you. A pause. We don't want to have to tell the court that you've been exhibiting signs of cognitive decline since Dad died. The neighbors have noticed. Bill Garrett has already mentioned. Bill Garrett is my witness, I said, and has been for the last 2 weeks. Another silence. Longer. Don't do this, she said. Her voice had lost the careful quality now. Something raw underneath it. You will lose. You're 68 years old, and you're alone, and you have no idea what Trent is capable of. I hung up. My hands were trembling slightly when I set the phone down. I was sitting in the small room I'd been renting by the week at a place called the Clover Inn, 3 miles from Clover Street. It was a modest room, 1 bed, a table, a window overlooking a parking lot. But it was mine in a way the house had stopped feeling the moment I read that false document. I took 3 deep breaths. Then I called Carol and told her about the call, including the threat about cognitive decline. She told me to document it in writing immediately and email it to her. I did. The next move came from Trent, and it came in person. He found me at the diner on 5th, where I'd started having breakfast most mornings. I don't know if he followed me or asked around. Dayton is not a large city, and I'd lived there my whole life. He slid into the booth across from me without being invited, a large man in a good jacket, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at me in a way that was meant to feel like a wall. "Martha," he said. He'd never called me by my first name in 4 years of living in my house. Always Mom, or when he remembered his manners, Mrs. Collins. "You've filed a contest," he said. "You've frozen Gerald's accounts. Do you understand what that means practically? Those accounts were going to be distributed. Diane was going to use that money to pay off a significant debt. A significant debt, Martha." He let that sit. "If those funds stay frozen while some court proceeding drags on for 18 months, certain people we owe money to are going to become very unhappy." I looked at him across the table. He was trying to frighten me with implications. Dangerous creditors, shadowy consequences. It was the kind of threat that counted on a 68-year-old widow not knowing exactly how frightened to be. "Trent," I said, "are you telling me that you and my daughter defrauded Gerald's estate to pay off a personal debt?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that framing. "I'm saying, because if that's what you're saying, you should probably be talking to a criminal attorney rather than to me." I picked up my coffee cup. "We're done here." He sat for another moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and left without another word. I paid for my breakfast, walked to my car, and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. I was not made of iron. The mention of dangerous debts worried me, not for my own safety exactly, but for the shape of the problem. If Diane and Trent were in serious financial trouble, they were desperate. Desperate people make unpredictable choices. I called Carol, reported the conversation. She said 2 things: documented and good. Then she told me the forensic examiner had agreed to testify, and that Patricia Owens, the notary, had agreed to provide a deposition. "The case is solid," Carol said. "Don't let them rattle you." That evening, I drove to my sister Ruth's house in Columbus and stayed for 4 days. Ruth made soup and didn't ask too many questions, and let me sit on her back porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching her bird feeder for long stretches of time. I slept for 9 hours the first night, the first real sleep I'd had since October. I read a novel I didn't finish. I called Carol once a day for updates and otherwise put the phone face down on the guest room dresser. I needed those 4 days, not to hide, not to give up. To remember that I was a person with a whole life and not just a case number in a probate dispute. Gerald would have told me the same thing. "Take the break, Martha. You'll need your energy for what comes next." He was always right about that kind of thing. When I came back from Columbus, there was an envelope under the door of my room at the Clover Inn. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a number at the top. $2 million, and 3 sentences below it. "We are prepared to offer a full and final settlement. You will receive $2 million and the legal costs of your filing, paid in full. In return, you will withdraw the will contest and agree to no further legal action." I read it twice. Then I photographed it, emailed the photograph to Carol, and put the paper in the folder where I kept all my case documents. $2 million. If I had been a different kind of person, a tired person, a frightened person, or simply a person who had never found that envelope under Gerald's workbench, $2 million might have felt like a rescue. It was more money than I'd ever had in my own hands. It would have bought me a comfortable life, a nice apartment, peace. But $2 million out of $80 million is not a settlement. It's an insult dressed in a suit. More importantly, it was an admission. You don't offer money to someone you believe has no case. Diane and Trent were scared, and that meant Carol and I were doing something right. I called Carol. They offered $2 million, I said. A brief pause. Decline it. Already planned to. She almost laughed. Good. Don't respond to them directly. I'll send a formal rejection through their attorney. I assume they filed this through counsel? It came unsigned under my motel room door. Longer pause. That's either sloppy or intentional. Either way, photograph everything. Preserve the envelope. Note the date and time you found it. She paused again. They're getting nervous, Martha. Nervous people make mistakes. Let them. I did. The offer must have been Diane's idea, because Trent's response to the rejection was to park his car on the street outside the Clover Inn for 2 evenings in a row. Visible from my window, just sitting there, not coming in, not calling. Just present. Watching. It was the kind of thing that was hard to report to police and easy to feel. I reported it to Carol anyway, who wrote a formal letter to Trent's attorney noting the behavior and using the word harassment. The parking stopped after that. It was during these days, the quiet, watchful days when Diane and Trent had stepped back into observation mode and Carol's legal machinery was moving forward without requiring me to do much, that I realized how alone I had allowed myself to become since Gerald died. Grief does that. It makes the world very small and very interior. Bill Garrett called on a Thursday evening. He'd gotten my number from Ruth, he said, and he wanted to check in. I'd known Bill for 22 years. His wife Joan had been my closest friend until she passed in 2018. We talked for an hour. He told me he'd already given a written statement to Carol's investigator about what he'd observed in the weeks after the funeral. Trent's methodical movements, the padlock on the study, the night he'd seen Diane loading boxes from the house into their car at 11 p.m., while Gerald had been dead less than 2 months. 11 p.m. boxes. What had been in those boxes? I should have told you sooner, Bill said. I didn't know if it was my business. It's your business, I said. You were Gerald's friend. I was, he said quietly. He would have hated this. There was a woman at my church, Grace Presbyterian, where I'd attended for 30 years, named Dorothy Hale. She was 81, sharp as a tack, and had run the women's Bible study for 2 decades. She had watched my marriage, attended Gerald's funeral, and sent me a card every week for the first 2 months after he died. I called her, finally, and told her the short version of what was happening. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You come to the study on Wednesday. You sit with us, and you let us pray for this. And for you." I went. I sat in Dorothy's living room among 7 women between the ages of 60 and 85, and I let them pray. I didn't cry until the drive home, and then I cried for about 10 minutes and felt considerably lighter afterward. The legal process doesn't move fast. Carol had warned me of that. But it moves steadily if you have the right documents and the right people, and I was beginning to understand that I had both. What I didn't realize yet, what would become clear only later, was that Diane and Trent, watching from their distance, were preparing one more approach. Not a bribe this time. Something that looked, on the surface, much more like love. She came alone. That was the first thing that surprised me. Diane knocked on the door of my room at the Clover Inn on a Sunday afternoon, without Trent, without an attorney, with a paper bag from the Italian bakery on Maple Street, the one where we used to buy cannoli when she was a child. She was dressed quietly, no jewelry, hair loose. She looked tired. She looked, for a moment, almost like my daughter. "Mom," she said, "can I come in? Just to talk, nothing official, just us." I thought about Carol's standing instruction. Don't meet with them alone. Then I looked at my daughter in the doorway, holding a bag of cannoli, and I stepped back to let her in, because whatever I had decided, I had not decided to stop being her mother. She sat at the small table by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the bag, set a cannoli on a napkin for me, kept one for herself, and for a moment we just sat there the way we used to when she came home from college, and we needed to ease back into each other before we could talk about anything real. "I know you're angry," she said. "You have a right to be. Things were said that shouldn't have been. Trent was under so much pressure, and I followed his lead when I shouldn't have." She looked at the table. "Dad's money was supposed to fix everything. I didn't think about what it would cost you. I'm sorry, Mom. I mean that." She sounded like she meant it. Did she mean it? I looked at her face. I had been looking at that face for 45 years. I had known it through every phase and change it had gone through, and I tried to find the truth in it. And the uncomfortable thing, the thing I want to be honest about, is that part of me wanted to believe her. Grief had made me lonely. The months at the Clover Inn had been quiet in a way that sometimes felt like punishment. She was my daughter. "Tell me something," I said. "The will that was filed in probate, did you know it wasn't the real one?" A silence. Fractional. Maybe 2 seconds. But I caught it. "Mom, Dad signed that will. Did you know it wasn't real?" She looked at me steadily. "You need to drop this. Not for my sake. For yours. The attorneys are going to drag this out for years. You're 68 years old. You could be spending this time at peace, with money to live comfortably, instead of fighting a legal battle you might not win." She leaned forward slightly. "You found some handwritten pages in a garage. That could have been anything. Dad used to write notes, drafts. You know that. My attorney says that document isn't going to hold up to the standard the court requires." There it was. Under the cannoli, under the soft voice, under the tired eyes. "You will lose, and you know it. So why not stop now?" "Your attorney," I said, "hasn't seen Dr. Bell's report?" Something flickered behind her eyes. "Who? It was good of you to come, Diane." I stood up. "Everything from here goes through Carol Vance. You have her number." She stood too. The softness left her face then, not all at once, but like a stage light slowly dimming. What was underneath it was not rage exactly. It was something colder, the look of someone recalculating. "You're going to regret this," she said. Her voice was quiet. Quiet is sometimes worse than loud. "Not because we'll do anything, just because you're burning the last of this family down and you can't see it. When this is over, when you've made us all go through this, there won't be anything left between us. You understand that?" I held the door open. She left without taking the cannoli. I closed the door and stood in the middle of that small room and let myself feel what was true. I was afraid. Not of the legal outcome. Carol had given me solid reasons for confidence. I was afraid of the thing Diane had named, the thing she'd used as a weapon precisely because it had a point. There won't be anything left between us. The family, whatever it had been, was already gone. Gerald was dead. The daughter I'd raised had forged her father's will. There was no version of this story in which everyone went home happy. But fear, I had learned that autumn is not the same as wrong. I picked up the cannoli she'd brought me, wrapped it back in the napkin, and sat down to call Carol. I told her about the visit, the line about Dr. Bell, which means they don't know the scope of the forensic report, and the veiled threat at the end. "Let her worry about what else you have," Carol said. "That's exactly where we want her." I said goodnight and set the phone down. Outside my window, Dayton was going dark in the November evening. Somewhere on Clover Street, my rose bushes were past their season, dormant in the cold. I thought about Gerald leaving that envelope in the garage. I thought about him sitting in the UPS store, asking for a glass of water, wanting to do it right. He tried to protect me. The least I could do was finish it. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January, the kind of Ohio winter day when the sky is a uniform gray and the cold has a specific, serious quality to it. The Franklin County Courthouse, the case had been transferred there on procedural grounds, smelled like industrial cleaner and old marble. I wore the dark blue dress I'd worn to Gerald's firm's retirement dinner in 2019. He had said I looked like myself in it. That seemed right. Carol had prepared me thoroughly over the preceding weeks. I knew the order of witnesses, the documents that would be presented, the arguments Diane's attorney, a man named Ferris, expensive suit, imprecise eyes, would likely make. The opposing strategy, Carol had explained, will be to argue that the handwritten will is the anomaly, that Gerald was confused or impaired when he wrote it, that it lacks the formal requirements of a valid Ohio will, and that the notarized document represents his true intentions. She'd paused. They will not be expecting the full scope of what we have. We had Dr. Bell's complete forensic report, which had been finalized and ran to 41 pages. We had Patricia Owens, the notary, who had traveled from her home that morning and was sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom with her carbon copies and her meticulous records. We had Bill Garrett, who had submitted a written statement and was prepared to testify. And we had something Carol's investigator, Ray Dutton, had found during a deeper review of Gerald's financial records. A wire transfer, made 6 months before Gerald's death, from a brokerage account Gerald controlled to a joint account belonging to Diane and Trent. A transfer of $340,000, which corresponded exactly to a debt repayment record found through publicly filed court documents in Indiana. Diane and Trent had needed money. They had gotten some once, legally. And then Gerald had apparently stopped. And then 4 months after Gerald died, a will appeared that gave them everything. The hearing room was small. This was a probate matter, not a jury trial. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Moore, 60 or so, who gave the impression of having heard every variety of human misbehavior that a family could generate and retaining her capacity for impartiality despite it. She ran her courtroom efficiently and without theater. Diane and Trent sat at the respondent's table with Attorney Ferris. Diane was in black. Trent was in a gray suit that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent at the Clover Inn. Neither of them looked at me when I came in. I looked at them, though. I had time. I studied Diane's profile. The set of her jaw, the careful stillness she was maintaining. And I thought about the girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat on long drives, who called me from college at 11 p.m. because she was homesick and wouldn't admit it. I thought about all the ways love can be used against you by the very person you gave it to. Then I turned and faced forward, and I was done looking back. Dr. Bell testified first. She walked the court through her methodology: exemplar collection, pressure mapping, baseline analysis, in the even technical voice of someone who had done this many times before. When Attorney Ferris cross-examined her, trying to suggest her methodology was subjective, she dismantled his questions with the patience of someone correcting a student who hasn't done the reading. The signature on the probate will, she testified, showed clear signs of having been produced by someone other than Gerald Collins. The signature on the handwritten will was consistent with all known exemplars across decades of documents. Patricia Owens testified next. She identified Gerald from the photograph. She produced her records. She described the signing, the date, the time, the ID, the glass of water, the slight heaviness in his manner. She had the carbon copies, every page. When Ferris attempted to suggest her memory of a single appointment years prior was unreliable, she opened her binder and placed her carbon records on the witness stand one by one, quietly, without drama, like a woman who had been keeping careful records her entire professional life precisely because she understood that one day they might matter. The courtroom was very still during that moment. Even Judge Moore leaned forward slightly. Then Carol introduced the wire transfer. Ferris objected on relevance grounds. Judge Moore overruled him with one word: overruled. She was looking at the documents with an expression I had learned from years of reading people meant she had already drawn a conclusion and was waiting for the rest of the evidence to confirm it. It was during Carol's summary argument that I watched Diane and Trent for the first time with something other than grief. I watched them as people. Trent was very still, the stillness of a man trying to perform calm and not quite achieving it. His jaw worked slightly, the way it does when someone is grinding through options and finding them all closed. Diane had been composed through most of the morning, but when Carol cited the wire transfer, when Carol said the phrase, "pattern of financial extraction beginning while Mr. Collins was alive," I saw Diane's hand on the table tighten. Then she whispered something to Ferris. Sharp, urgent. And he placed his hand briefly on her arm in the way attorneys do when they are telling a client to stop talking. She pulled her arm away. Trent, beside her, did not look at her. They were no longer a united front. Whatever coordination they had walked in with was fraying under the weight of what was being said in that room, and I could see it happening in real time. People who build plans on lies have no contingency for the moment the lies are named out loud in a court of law. Then Carol said, "And we note for the record that Mrs. Collins was, in fact, directed to the detached garage as her sole inheritance. The same garage in which Mr. Collins had concealed the authentic testamentary document, apparently in anticipation of exactly this scenario." Judge Moore looked up at that. She looked at me briefly, then at the table where Carol and I sat, and then back at the documents. Ferris made his arguments. He called the handwritten will informal, procedurally questionable, potentially drafted under duress. He suggested Gerald had been lonely and anxious in his final months, and that the handwritten document represented a passing mood rather than genuine testamentary intent. He did not call Diane or Trent to testify, a decision that, Carol had predicted, would not go unnoticed by a judge experienced in probate fraud. Judge Moore did not rule from the bench that day. She said she would review the materials and issue a written decision within 30 days. Standard procedure. But when we stood for her exit, she paused at the door of the chamber and looked out over the room for a moment, the way someone does when they're organizing a thought. She didn't say anything. She went through the door. In the hallway afterward, Diane walked past me without speaking. Trent was 2 steps behind her. At the elevator, he turned and looked back at me once. I met his eyes. I did not look away. He got in the elevator. Carol touched my arm. "That went well," she said, which from Carol was the equivalent of someone else saying we won. I buttoned my coat against the January cold and walked out of the courthouse into the gray Ohio morning, and for the first time in months, maybe for the first time since that Tuesday in March when Gerald washed his coffee mug and didn't come back from the kitchen, I felt something that was close to peace. Close to was enough, for now. Judge Moore's written decision arrived on a Friday, 26 days after the hearing. Carol called me at 8:47 in the morning. I was at the diner on 5th, with coffee going cold in front of me, because I'd been too nervous to drink it properly for the past week. I had ordered toast and not touched it. The waitress, a young woman named Petra, who had learned over the preceding months not to ask me how I was doing until I'd had at least half a cup, refilled my coffee without a word and left me alone with my phone on the table. "Martha," Carol said, "it's everything." I set down the cup. The decision ran to 18 pages. Carol walked me through it over the phone, but she also emailed it to me, and I read every word that afternoon sitting in my room at the Clover Inn with the heat going and the parking lot outside, gray and quiet. Judge Moore had found, based on the preponderance of evidence, that the will filed in probate was not a valid expression of Gerald Collins's testamentary intent. She cited Dr. Bell's forensic report at length. She cited the testimony of Patricia Owens and the notary records. She cited the wire transfer as evidence of a pattern of financial manipulation and noted that the timing of the contested will's appearance, discovered only after Gerald's death, never discussed with his spouse of 45 years, inconsistent with his known estate planning discussions, failed to satisfy the burden of authenticity. The handwritten will, she found, met Ohio's requirements for a valid holographic will. It was entirely in Gerald's handwriting, signed and dated. The notarization at the UPS store, while unusual, had been properly executed and documented. Gerald's intent was clear. His language was unambiguous. The contested will was set aside. Gerald's estate would be distributed according to the authentic document. The house to me, half the investment accounts to me, and $3 million with the jewelry to Diane. And then there was a final paragraph. Judge Moore had referred the matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to the submission of a fraudulent instrument to the probate court. Fraud on the court, a felony in Ohio. I read that paragraph 3 times. I thought about Diane sitting across from me at the kitchen table with that flat, certain smile. I thought about Trent sliding into the booth at the diner on 5th with his hands flat on the table like a wall. I thought about the settlement offer slipped under my door at the Clover Inn. $2 million, as if 45 years of a life could be bought at a discount. All of it, every calculation they had made, had rested on the assumption that I would not fight, or that if I fought, I would lose. They had been wrong on both counts, and now the machinery of consequence, the slow, impersonal, utterly reliable machinery of it, was moving toward them the same way it moves toward everyone who mistakes an old woman's grief for weakness. Carol told me that Diane and Trent's attorney had already indicated they would appeal the decision. They can, Carol said, but the forensic evidence is solid, the notary testimony is solid, and the wire transfer pattern is on record. An appeal won't change those facts. It will cost them time and money they don't appear to have. They did file an appeal. It was denied 5 months later by the Ohio Court of Appeals in a 1-paragraph ruling that cited no new legal questions warranting review. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation. 6 months after Judge Moore's decision, Diane and Trent were each charged with 1 count of forgery, 1 count of fraud on the court, and 1 count of theft by deception, the latter relating to the unauthorized extraction of Gerald's funds during his lifetime. Trent was additionally charged with a securities-related offense that emerged from the investigation into their financial records, involving money that had nothing to do with Gerald and everything to do with a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years before any of this began. I did not feel triumph when I heard about the charges. I want to be clear about that. I felt a very specific, quiet kind of rightness, the way a thing feels when it has come back to where it belongs. Gerald had signed those papers in a UPS store because he feared this and wanted me to be safe. The court had found what he left for me. That was enough. My attorney filed the paperwork to retake possession of the house on Clover Street. By the end of February, nearly 5 months after Diane had told me to leave, I walked back through my own front door. The rose bushes along the fence were still dormant. The floors still creaked in the same places. The study, when I unlocked it with a key Carol had obtained through the estate process, was disordered. Files moved, boxes opened, but nothing of real legal importance had been removed. Most of what Diane and Trent had taken was documentation Carol had already replicated from financial institutions. I stood in the study for a long time. Gerald's handwriting was everywhere in that room, on folder labels, on the backs of photographs, on the notepad he kept by the phone. I had spent months being afraid in small, rented rooms, eating alone at diner counters, sleeping with the case documents on the nightstand because they were the closest thing I had to solid ground. Now I was standing in the room where Gerald had done his thinking for 30 years, surrounded by the evidence of his careful, quiet, decent life. And I was not afraid of anything. I felt him very strongly there, not as an absence, as a presence. I went to the garage and sat in the folding chair. Then I got up, went back inside, and made myself a cup of coffee. The house was mine. The estate was settled. The truth was in the record. Gerald had done his job. I had done mine. Spring came to Clover Street the way it always did in Ohio. Slowly, then all at once. By April, the rose bushes had new growth. By May, they were blooming, red and yellow along the front fence, the same as they had been for 20 years. I planted a new bed along the back porch, something I'd been wanting to do for years but somehow never found the time for. Gerald would have said the timing was right. I spent that spring and summer making the house mine in ways that grief and then conflict had prevented. I repainted the study, a warm cream color, lighter than it had been. I had the floors refinished. I bought a proper chair for the back porch and made a habit of sitting in it every evening with a book and whatever the birds decided to visit the feeder I'd hung from the eave. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that are, in the end, the whole of a life. Ruth came up from Columbus in June and stayed for a week. We went through old photographs together and talked about Gerald and about our parents and about the way time moves, and neither of us talked about Diane more than once. There wasn't much to say that the court hadn't already said. Carol had connected me with a financial advisor through her professional network, a woman named Helen Park, who specialized in estate management for widows and retirees. Between the house, the investment accounts, and the settlement of Gerald's estate, I was not an enormously wealthy woman, but I was a comfortable one. I did not have to worry about money. That was Gerald's gift to me, the one he'd tried to protect from the beginning. I started volunteering at the hospital, something I'd thought about for years without doing. 2 mornings a week, sitting with patients who didn't have visitors, reading aloud or just talking. I was apparently good at sitting with people. I had, as Dorothy from the Bible study pointed out, a lot of practice. Bill Garrett and I had Sunday dinner together most weeks. He was a good cook, better than he admitted, and he had a large collection of old jazz records and a habit of telling stories about his teaching years that were either funny or quietly devastating, depending on the week. I liked his company. Gerald had liked it too. It felt like a thread of continuity. In September, Dorothy organized a small gathering at her house. The women from the Bible study, plus a few others from the church who had followed the story. They were not gossips, these women. They had simply been praying for me for months and wanted to see that the answer had come. I brought the cannoli from the Italian bakery on Maple Street. It seemed like the right thing. As for Diane and Trent, the criminal trial was scheduled for the following January. Their attorneys pursued negotiations with the prosecutor's office, and ultimately, both entered plea agreements. Trent pleaded guilty to fraud on the court and the securities charge. He received a suspended sentence, a $400,000 fine, and 3 years of probation. Diane pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of filing a false instrument. She received 2 years of probation, a fine, and was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service. Neither went to prison, which I have complicated feelings about. Carol said the plea deals were consistent with how Ohio courts handle first offense white-collar fraud by defendants with no prior criminal record. I understood the legal reasoning. I also understood that Gerald's entire life savings might have disappeared into their hands if I had not found that envelope. But I had found it. That was the point. The $3 million that Gerald had left Diane in the authentic will was technically still hers to receive. She received it, minus the fines. She and Trent moved away from Dayton to somewhere in Arizona, I was told by someone who had heard it from someone else. I didn't follow the news of their lives. It wasn't mine to follow. What I know is this. They had built their plan on the assumption that I was too old, too grieved, too alone to fight them. They had underestimated what Gerald had left in that garage. They had underestimated what 45 years of a good marriage looks like from the inside. The trust it builds, the way it teaches you to recognize truth even when someone is working very hard to hide it. The last Saturday in October, I drove to the UPS store across town. I went inside and asked to speak to whomever handled notary services. The woman who came out was young, late 20s maybe. I told her that a woman named Patricia Owens had worked here some years before, and that her careful record-keeping had made a significant difference in my life. I asked if she could pass that along, or if there was any way to reach Mrs. Owens. She took my name and number and said she'd try. 2 weeks later, Patricia Owens called me. She was retired now, living with her daughter in Kentucky. We talked for half an hour. I told her what had happened in full. She was quiet for a moment at the end, and then she said, "Your husband seemed like a good man." "He was," I said. "He wanted to do it right," she said. "He told me that." Yes, he had. And because he had, and because I found what he left for me, we did. Gerald always said that a person's true character is revealed not in what they do when things are easy, but in what they do when everything has been taken from them. I was 68 years old, alone in a cold garage, with nothing but an old blanket and a hidden envelope, and 45 years of knowing what my husband's handwriting looked like. That was enough. If you are ever told you are too old, too tired, too alone to fight for what is right, remember, sometimes the answer is already waiting for you in the place they forgot to look. What would you have done? If this story moved you, please share it and leave a comment. Thank you for being here. My son sold my beach house and my car to pay off his debts. When I returned, he mocked, "Congratulations! Now you're homeless." I smiled. He didn't know that this house was actually... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I spent 31 years being careful with money. That was what people never understood about me. They looked at the beach house on Sullivan's Island, at my white Buick in the driveway, at my little garden with the hydrangeas, and they assumed I had always been comfortable. But comfort like that doesn't fall from the sky. It comes from decades of packed lunches and secondhand furniture and saying "not this year" when the grandchildren asked for Disney World. My husband Roy and I built everything we had with quiet discipline. When Roy died of a stroke 11 years ago, he left me with a paid-off house in Charleston, a modest savings account, and a beach cottage on Sullivan's Island that we had bought in 1987 for reasons that had everything to do with love and nothing to do with investment. I kept working as a bookkeeper until I was 65, and then I retired, tended my garden, read my library books, and tried not to be a burden to anyone. Derek was our only child. I want to be fair to him, even now. He was funny as a boy, quick-witted, charming, the kind of kid who could talk his way out of anything. Roy used to say that was a gift. I came to understand it was also a warning. By the time Derek was in his 30s, the charm had curdled into something else. A pattern of borrowed money, collapsed business ventures, and explanations that were always almost convincing. There was the landscaping company that would have worked if the partner hadn't stolen from him. There was the bar he co-owned in Mount Pleasant that closed after 14 months. There was Brittany, his wife, who had her own talent for spending money that didn't exist yet. I loved my son. I want that on the record. I loved him the way you love someone whose flaws you understand completely and forgive anyway. The first sign I should have taken more seriously came 18 months before everything fell apart. Derek called me on a Tuesday evening. He only ever called on weekday evenings when he needed something, and asked very casually whether I had ever thought about simplifying my estate. He said he had been reading about probate. He said it might be easier for everyone if certain assets were transferred into a joint arrangement before something happened to me. I told him I had a will, drawn up by my attorney Tom Hargrove, and that everything was in order. Derek laughed and said, of course. Of course he was just thinking about saving me trouble. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing, and then he hung up. Why didn't I trust that feeling in my stomach that night? Maybe because he was my son. Maybe because doubt feels like disloyalty when it's pointed at your own child. The second sign came 6 months later. Derek asked if he could borrow the Sullivan's Island cottage for a few weeks while he sorted out some financial unpleasantness. I agreed. What I didn't know was that a few weeks became 4 months, and that during those 4 months he had apparently been showing the property to people I had never met. I found out about that by accident from my neighbor Carol Whitmore, who mentioned over the phone that she had seen a young couple with a real estate agent walking around my cottage on a Thursday morning. I called Derek. He said Carol was confused. He said it was probably the neighbor's place. He said it so smoothly that I almost believed him. Almost. I had planned a trip to visit my sister Ruth in Savannah. 10 days. Ruth was recovering from a hip replacement and needed company. I kissed my hydrangeas goodbye, asked Carol to keep an eye on things, and drove south in my Buick. I came home on a Friday afternoon in October. The Buick I came home in was Ruth's car, because my Buick was gone from the driveway. I stood on the front porch of my Charleston house with my suitcase, and I called Derek. He answered on the third ring. "Mom," he said. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not guilt exactly, but the specific lightness of someone who has already decided he has won. "Derek, where is my car?" A pause. Then, in a tone that was almost playful, "Mom, I need you to stay calm. There were some debts, some urgent situations. I had to make some decisions." "What decisions?" "The cottage is sold. The Buick is sold. I know this is a shock, but honestly..." And here he actually laughed, a short, bright laugh that I will hear in my memory until I die. "Congratulations, Mom. You're basically homeless now." I stood very still on that porch. The October sun was warm on my face. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the hydrangeas. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. God, it hurt in a way I don't have words for. I smiled because Derek, in his cleverness, had made one enormous mistake. And in that moment, standing on my own front porch with an empty driveway and a gutted heart, I knew exactly what it was. I didn't go inside right away. I sat down on the porch steps. The same steps Roy had painted white 3 separate times over the years because he could never find exactly the right shade. And I let myself feel it. All of it. The betrayal, the humiliation, the specific, nauseating grief of being wronged by someone you made. Derek had sold the Sullivan's Island cottage, the cottage Roy and I had bought for $42,000 in 1987, which by last year's market was worth somewhere north of $800,000. He had sold my car, a 2019 Buick Enclave I had paid for in cash 2 years ago, worth about $26,000. He had done this while I was in Savannah, caring for my sister, because he had calculated, correctly, that I would be gone long enough for the transactions to close. That was the arithmetic of my loss, over $800,000. Gone. Transferred to pay off debts I had never been consulted about by a person who had no legal right to touch either property. Or so Derek believed he had. Did he know what he had actually done? Did he understand the specific legal geography of what he thought was his to sell? I was a bookkeeper for 31 years. I understood paperwork. I understood the difference between what a document says on its face and what it actually means. But I am getting ahead of myself. That afternoon, sitting on those white painted steps, I was not yet calculating. I was grieving. There is a version of this story where I call a lawyer immediately, where I am sharp and tactical from the first moment. That is not the true version. The true version is that I cried. I cried quietly, with the mockingbird still singing, until the sun moved behind the neighbor's oak tree and the porch fell into shade. Then I went inside, put the kettle on, and called my friend Diane. Diane Beauchamp had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met in a church choir in 2002 and discovered we were both recently widowed, both suspicious of casseroles brought by well-meaning neighbors, and both constitutionally unable to pretend things were fine when they weren't. She was 71, retired from nursing, and she had the particular clarity of mind that comes from 40 years of emergency medicine. I told her everything, start to finish. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her great gifts. When I finished, she said, "Peggy, before you do anything else, you need to know exactly what was sold and exactly how." That was the sentence that cut through the grief and started the engine. The next morning, Saturday, I drove Ruth's borrowed car to my attorney's office. Tom Hargrove didn't work Saturdays, but he had given me his cell number years ago after Roy died, and I used it. He picked up after 2 rings. I explained the situation in the flat, factual voice I used to use when presenting quarterly accounts. Tom listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "Come in Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Don't talk to Derek before then. Don't confirm or deny anything. Just listen." I spent that weekend doing something Derek would not have expected. I was not panicking. I was documenting. I went through every paper file I kept in the fireproof cabinet in my bedroom closet. I was looking for a specific set of documents: the original deed to the Sullivan's Island property, the title paperwork for the Buick, and a particular letter that Tom Hargrove had sent me in 2019. I found all 3 within the hour. I photographed each page with my phone and emailed the images to Tom and to my own email address as backup. Then I called the Charleston County Register of Deeds. Their offices were closed for the weekend, but I knew from years of professional habit that property transfer records are public. I found the online portal and searched the address of the Sullivan's Island cottage. There it was, a deed transfer recorded 11 days ago. The seller was listed as Derek Roy Callahan. I stared at that name on my laptop screen for a long moment. Derek Roy Callahan. Not Margaret Ann Callahan. Not the Callahan Family Trust. Derek Roy Callahan, acting as sole owner. Here was the thing Derek did not know. The thing that was going to matter more than anything else in the months ahead. In 2019, after a long conversation with Tom Hargrove about estate planning, I had restructured how the beach cottage was held. It was no longer in my name alone. It was held in a revocable living trust, the Roy and Margaret Callahan Family Trust, of which I was the sole trustee. Derek's name appeared nowhere in that trust document. He had no authority to sell, no power of attorney, nothing. What he had done, in legal terms, was sell a property he did not own. That is called fraud. I closed my laptop. I made another cup of tea. I sat at Roy's old kitchen table in the house we had shared for 28 years, and I understood that what was coming was not going to be simple or quick or painless. Derek had a wife who would fight alongside him. He had lawyers he'd used before, not good ones, but ones willing to be aggressive. He would claim confusion. He would claim I had verbally authorized the sale. He would do what he always did: talk smoothly and loudly, and wait for everyone to get tired. But I was a bookkeeper. I understood paper trails. And the paper trail here was going to tell a very different story than the one Derek intended to tell. My first plan was simple: establish the fraud before Derek realized I knew the full legal picture. Get Tom engaged formally. get law enforcement notified before Derek had time to move money or destroy records. I was 68 years old. I was widowed and temporarily without a car. I was also, I realized as I rinsed my teacup at the kitchen sink, angrier than I had been at anything in my entire life. Good. I was going to need that. Sunday passed slowly. I went to the 11 o'clock service at St. Philip's, sat in the same pew Roy and I had shared for 20 years, and prayed. Not for forgiveness toward Derek. Not yet. But for clarity. For steadiness. For the kind of patience that outlasts cleverness. Derek called twice that day. I did not answer. I let both calls go to voicemail and did not listen to the messages. Tom had said don't confirm or deny anything, and I had learned enough about my son to know that a phone conversation with him was an opportunity to be maneuvered, not informed. Whatever he had to say could wait until I was standing on better ground. Monday morning, I was at Tom Hargrove's office on Broad Street at 5 minutes to 8. Tom Hargrove was 64, silver-haired, and had the manner of a man who had spent 4 decades hearing people's worst news and taking it seriously without being destroyed by it. He had handled Roy's estate, both our wills and the trust restructuring in 2019. He knew our paperwork the way a doctor knows a long-term patient, not just the facts, but the history behind the facts. I laid everything on his conference table, the original trust document. The deed I had photographed from the county portal, the Buick title, which was registered to the Callahan Family Trust as well, a detail I hadn't mentioned to Derek because it had never seemed necessary. Tom put on his reading glasses and went through each document in careful silence. After about 15 minutes, he set the glasses down and looked at me. "Peggy," he said, "Derek had no legal authority to sell either asset. The cottage was trust property. The vehicle title lists the trust as owner. He is not a trustee. He has no power of attorney. Whatever signatures appeared on those documents were not obtained with your consent?" "I was in Savannah," I said. "I never signed anything." Tom nodded slowly. "Then we are looking at deed fraud, title fraud, and potentially wire fraud if the proceeds crossed state lines or went through electronic transfers. This is not a civil dispute. This is criminal." I had known that intellectually since Saturday. Hearing Tom say it aloud in his careful lawyer's voice made it solid in a way it hadn't been before. "What do we do first?" I asked. "First, I file an emergency motion to void the deed transfer on the basis of fraudulent conveyance. The trust was the legal owner, the transfer was unauthorized, and the recorded deed is invalid. That goes to the court today." Simultaneously, we report to the Charleston County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Attorney General's Fraud Division. You will need to give a formal statement. "And the buyers?" I asked. "The people who bought the cottage?" Tom's expression was careful. "The buyers may be innocent parties, which complicates the real estate picture. But a void transfer means the property legally never left the trust. The court will determine remedies for the buyers against Derek, not against you. Your property rights were never extinguished because Derek had no authority to extinguish them." I sat with that for a moment. $800,000. Not gone. Stolen, yes, but not gone. "Let's begin," I said. While Tom's paralegal began preparing the emergency motion, Tom walked me 2 blocks to the sheriff's office on Lockwood Drive. I sat across from a detective named Hale, a calm, deliberate woman in her 40s, and gave a complete statement. I brought my documents. I brought the photographs. I told her about the deed transfer I had found online, about the car, about the fact that Derek had called me on Friday afternoon and laughed. Detective Hale took notes and recorded the interview. She told me an investigation would be opened and that I should not confront Derek directly. She said they would need to obtain financial records and that I should expect this to take time. Time. Did I have time? Derek had the sale proceeds somewhere. Money moves fast when someone is motivated. That was the thing worrying me as I walked back to Tom's office. Derek wasn't stupid. He was lazy and impulsive, but he wasn't stupid. And Brittany was sharper than he was in certain tactical ways. She understood how to move money through accounts, how to create plausible distance between a transaction and its source. What I didn't know yet, what I found out that same Monday afternoon, was that Derek had already begun to sense something was wrong. Tom's office called me at 3 o'clock. His paralegal, a young man named James, said that while filing the emergency motion, they had discovered that Derek had contacted the Charleston County Register of Deeds office that morning, 2 hours after my visit to Tom's office, and requested copies of the deed transfer documents. Why would Derek request those documents Monday morning unless someone had told him the deed was being examined? Nobody had told him, which meant Derek had been monitoring the property record online himself. He had a search alert on the address. He was watching. He had been watching all along. That changed things. It meant Derek knew that scrutiny had begun, even if he didn't know the exact shape of it yet. It meant the window before he started covering his tracks was shorter than I had hoped. I called Diane from Tom's waiting room. I spoke quietly because the chairs near me were occupied. "He's already moving," I said. "Then you move faster," she said. She was right, and as it happened, we already had more than Derek realized, because James, doing the deed research, had found something else, something that turned this from a difficult case into an airtight one: the signature on the fraudulent deed transfer. The signature, purporting to be that of the trustee of the Roy and Margaret Callahan Family Trust, had been notarized by a notary in North Charleston named Patricia Wynn. Patricia Wynn was Brittany's cousin. Patricia Wynn had a notary commission registered with the South Carolina Secretary of State's office. Tom pulled her public record before 5 o'clock that Monday. She had been commissioned 3 years ago and had no prior complaints. She was also, according to Brittany's public Facebook profile, which Tom's paralegal checked with professional thoroughness, listed as a bridesmaid at Derek and Brittany's wedding 9 years ago. A notary is not permitted to notarize a document in which she has a personal interest or a close relationship to a benefiting party. Notarizing a deed that transferred property fraudulently for her cousin's husband was not a clerical error. It was, at minimum, a violation of her commission and, given the surrounding circumstances, potentially criminal facilitation. Tom submitted the emergency motion to void the deed at 4:40 that afternoon. He also forwarded the notary information to Detective Hale. The court issued a temporary hold on the property pending a hearing scheduled for the following Wednesday. The deed transfer was flagged. The title to the Sullivan's Island cottage was, for legal purposes, frozen. The Buick was a separate track. Tom contacted the DMV through proper legal channels to flag the title transfer. The car had already been sold to a private buyer, a young man in Somerville who had paid Derek $14,000 in cash. That recovery would be more complicated, but Tom said we had a solid civil claim against Derek for the market value difference. I went home Monday evening and ate soup from a can and felt for the first time since Friday something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The paper trail was real. The evidence was documented. The legal machinery had started turning. Derek called at 9:15 that evening. I looked at his name on my phone screen. I did not answer. He called again at 9:40, and at 10, and at 10:20. Then the calls stopped. I went to bed. I slept better than I expected. At 11 o'clock Tuesday morning, I heard a car in my driveway. I looked out the front window and saw Derek's black Ford F-150 parked at the curb. Derek and Brittany got out. Brittany was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. Derek was walking with the slightly too deliberate stride of a man who had rehearsed this approach. I let them knock twice before I opened the door. I did not invite them in. I stood in the doorway. "Mom," Derek said. His voice had changed from Friday's breezy confidence. It was controlled now, careful. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I said. Brittany stepped forward slightly. She was 38, blonde, and had the particular skill of people who have spent their lives using emotional pressure as a tool. "Peggy," she said, using my first name the way she always did when she wanted to seem like an equal. "We understand you're upset, But Derek made decisions under real financial pressure, and we think if you just— I spoke with my attorney yesterday, I said, and with the sheriff's office, I gave a formal statement. The change in Derek's face was small, but absolute. The careful control slipped. Just for a second. Just enough. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat. You went to the police, he said. It was not a question. I reported a crime, I said. Yes. Mom. His voice dropped. The charm was gone entirely now, and what was underneath it was something I recognized from when he was a teenager, and I had caught him in a serious lie. Not remorse, but calculation. You don't understand the full picture. There are things here that could look very bad for you if this goes to court. Things about how the trust was structured, questions about whether the language— Tom Hargrove drafted that trust, I said. He also filed the motion to void the deed yesterday afternoon. Brittany made a short sound that might have been a laugh or a curse. She turned away from the door and pressed her fingers to her forehead. Derek leaned forward slightly. If you push this, you're going to put your own son in prison. Is that what you want? Over a house? Over a house that you stole, I said, and a car, and 30 years of my husband's work. We can pay you back, Brittany said, spinning back around, her voice sharp now. We can work out a payment plan. This doesn't have to be a legal situation. It's already a legal situation, I said. That happened when you forged a trust document and had your cousin notarize it. That landed. I watched it land. Brittany went very still. Derek looked at her, then back at me. And for the first time in his adult life, he appeared genuinely, completely afraid. You can leave now, I said. I stepped back and closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my back to the door and my heart hammering and waited to hear if they would knock again. They didn't. After a moment, I heard the F-150 start and pull away. I called Tom and told him about the visit. He said to document it, time, participants, what was said, and he told Detective Hale. She noted it as a potential witness intimidation contact. That afternoon, I packed a small bag and drove Ruth's borrowed car to Diane's house in Mount Pleasant. Diane made chicken and rice, real chicken and rice, not from a can. And we sat on her screened porch in the mild October evening and talked about things that had nothing to do with deeds or notaries or the specific cruelty of children who mistake a mother's patience for passivity. I stayed 3 days. I needed it. Not because I was giving up, but because what was coming was going to require me to be steady, and steadiness requires rest. I drove back to Charleston on a Friday morning. The hydrangeas in the front garden needed water. I took care of them first before I even brought my bag inside. Because Roy had planted them, and they deserved better than to suffer for someone else's crimes. There were 3 voicemails waiting on my home phone. I still had a landline. Roy had insisted on it, and I had kept it the way I kept several of his habits, as a form of continuity. The first message was from Tom, asking me to call when I was back. The second was from a number I didn't recognize. The third was Derek. Derek's voice on the message was different from anything I had heard from him in the 42 years he had been alive. It was softer, more careful. He said, and I played this back twice to make sure I was hearing it correctly, that he had been doing a lot of thinking, that he understood he had made serious mistakes, that he was not asking me to drop anything just to have one conversation, one meal even, that he had some money set aside. He used the phrase first installment, that he wanted to give me as a gesture of good faith. First installment. As if he could buy his way out of a felony with installment payments. I called Tom first. He had updates. The court hearing on the deed void was confirmed for Wednesday. Patricia Wynn's notary commission had been suspended pending investigation. The buyer of the Sullivan's Island cottage, a couple from Atlanta named Moorfield, had been informed of the disputed title and had engaged their own attorney. They were cooperating with the process and had filed a claim against Derek for breach of the sale contract. Derek's exposure was expanding in every direction. "How is he handling it?" I asked Tom. "From what I can tell, badly," Tom said. His previous attorney withdrew. He appears to be attempting to negotiate with multiple parties simultaneously, which rarely goes well. After I hung up with Tom, I called the unknown number back. It turned out to be a woman named Sandra Pryor, who worked with the South Carolina Attorney General's Elder Financial Abuse Unit. She had been assigned to my case as a parallel track alongside Detective Hale's investigation. She was efficient and kind, and she explained that what Derek had done fell clearly within the state's definition of elder financial exploitation, a serious felony carrying significant prison time. I was 68, not 90. I had all my faculties. I resented slightly the category of elder, but I understood its legal usefulness, and I thanked Sandra Pryor sincerely. It was later that same Friday afternoon that Derek and Brittany made their attempt at what I can only call seduction. The offer designed to make everything go away before Wednesday's hearing. Derek arrived alone this time. No Brittany. He stood on the porch steps with a manila envelope and an expression of such carefully constructed remorse that, 2 months earlier, it might have worked. "Mom," he said, "can I just leave this with you? I'm not asking you to make any decisions. I just need you to know that I'm trying to make it right." I stood inside the screen door. "What's in the envelope, Derek?" "A cashier's check. $50,000. It's not everything. I know that. But it's real, and it's yours. And there's more coming. I swear to you." $50,000 against $800,000 and a car and 3 weeks of my life and 42 years of choosing to love someone who had spent the last year calculating how to rob me. Was he serious? Did he believe truly that I was the kind of woman who could be bought back into silence with a cashier's check? "Derek," I said, "if I accept that check, I complicate the legal proceedings. It could be characterized as partial settlement, which muddies the fraud claim. Your attorney would know that, which means you don't have a new attorney yet, or the one you have told you to try this." He blinked. The remorse flickered. "Leave," I said. "Take the envelope." He left. He didn't say another word. He walked back to his truck with the manila envelope and drove away, and I watched from the screen door until the truck was out of sight. Then I called Carol Whitmore, my neighbor from Sullivan's Island, who had first told me about the real estate agents walking my property. I told her what was happening. Carol was 66 and had worked 30 years as a paralegal before retirement. She listened, and then she said something that mattered to me more than almost anything else that week. "Peggy," she said, "everyone on this island knew that cottage was yours. I will testify to that. Whoever needs to hear it, whenever they need to hear it." That was the social support I needed, not pity. Witness. Over that weekend, 3 more people came forward to Tom's office. My neighbor from Sullivan's Island on the other side of the cottage, a retired contractor who had done work on the property twice and had my signed checks as proof of ownership, and a woman from the island's community association who had corresponded with me about HOA fees as recently as July. All 3 were prepared to provide affidavits. The world was not standing aside for Derek and Brittany. The world was watching, and the world remembered the truth. I planted new impatiens along the front walk that Saturday. Roy had always said you could measure a person's faith in the future by whether they kept planting things. I planted 2 flats of impatiens and watered them well, and felt, for the first time since October, something very close to peace. They came together on a Tuesday evening, 4 days before the court hearing. I saw the F-150 from the kitchen window. Brittany was carrying a casserole dish. If I hadn't been so angry, I might have laughed. I opened the door before they knocked. Brittany smiled. The wide, practiced smile she deployed at family holidays when she wanted something from me. "Peggy," she said warmly, "we brought dinner. We just want to talk like a family. No lawyers, no—" She made a small, dismissive gesture. All of this. I looked at my son. Derek had dressed carefully. Pressed shirt, clean shave. He looked like a man going to church. "You can come in for 10 minutes," I said. "But I have nothing to decide tonight, and I won't be changing my position. So if that's the purpose of the visit, we should be clear about it up front." They came in. We sat at the kitchen table. Brittany set the casserole on the counter without being asked where to put it. That minor presumption, treating my kitchen like it was already negotiated territory, told me everything about where this conversation was actually headed. Derek began gently. He talked about the pressure he'd been under, a business debt that had come due faster than expected. He owed money to people who were not patient about repayment. He used the word dangerous once, briefly, in a way designed to suggest threat without specifying it, to make me imagine consequences for him that were worse than consequences from the law. He said he had panicked. He said he had made terrible decisions. He said he was sorry. He was good. He had always been good at this part. Brittany took over when Derek paused. She talked about family, about what a trial would do to all of us, the publicity, the stress, Derek's health. She mentioned almost offhandedly that Derek had been having chest episodes under the pressure of recent weeks. She looked at me with an expression calibrated to suggest that I, as his mother, bore some responsibility for his cardiac wellness. "I know you're hurt," Brittany said, "but you have to ask yourself, is destroying your son's life going to make you feel better? Is it worth a family?" There it was, the pivot. The suggestion that my legal rights were a form of selfishness, that withdrawing from the truth was what a good mother would do, that the crime was less important than the family structure the criminal lived within. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said. Derek leaned forward. "Just slow down. Ask Tom to delay the hearing. Give us a chance to work something out privately. If the hearing goes forward Wednesday, Peggy—" He paused, and his voice shifted. "Things are going to come out that are complicated. About the trust. About whether you understood what you were signing in 2019. Tom isn't infallible. We have someone looking at the trust language, and there are questions about whether you had capacity." I went very still. There it was. The real threat, offered in the smooth tones of family concern. They intended to challenge my mental capacity at the time of the trust's creation, to argue that a 65-year-old woman who had just retired from 30 years of bookkeeping had not understood the documents she signed with her attorney of 15 years. It was an ugly play. It was also a desperate one, which meant their situation was worse than they were showing. "Tom's paralegal has a video recording of our 2019 trust meeting," I said quietly. "Tom recorded all estate planning sessions after a malpractice case in 2017, taught him the value of documentation. That recording will show a 65-year-old woman asking precise, informed questions for approximately 45 minutes before signing anything." Brittany's expression didn't change immediately, but her hands, which were folded on the table, went very slightly still. "You should go," I said. "Dinner can stay or go. I don't mind either way." Derek stood up. The careful husband, the pressed shirt, all of it dropped at once. What looked back at me from my kitchen was someone I recognized and someone I didn't, simultaneously. "You're making a mistake," he said. It wasn't loud. Quiet threats are always the ones that find the bone. "I've made mistakes," I said. "Trusting you too long was one of them. I won't make it again." They left. Brittany took the casserole. I sat at the kitchen table after they drove away. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, exactly, but from the sustained effort of remaining calm during something that was fundamentally terrifying. Because it was terrifying. The idea that my own son would challenge my mental capacity in open court, that he would stand in front of a judge and argue that his mother was diminished. But fear, I had learned in 68 years, is information. It tells you what matters. And what this fear told me was not to retreat. It told me that retreat was impossible. Because if Derek was willing to attack my competence, he would do it whether I fought or not. Better to fight from a position of strength. I called Tom at 8 o'clock that evening and told him about the capacity threat. He was quiet for a moment. "The video," he said, "is quite good, Peggy. I'll have James get it formatted for submission by morning." "Thank you," I said. "Get some sleep," he said. "Wednesday is going to be a good day." Wednesday arrived with the particular clarity of a South Carolina autumn morning. The sky a clean, hard blue, the air finally cool enough to mean something. I put on the dark green dress I had worn to Roy's retirement dinner in 2003, because Roy had said that day that I looked like someone nobody should argue with, and I felt the truth of that description more acutely than I ever had before. Tom met me outside the courthouse on Broad Street at 8:45. He had a leather folder under his arm and the expression of a man who had reviewed his documents and found them satisfactory. "Ready?" he said. "Been ready since Friday in October," I said. The hearing was in a civil court, before Judge Patricia Ann Sorrells, who had the reputation, according to Tom, of running an efficient, facts-based courtroom with limited tolerance for melodrama. I found this encouraging. Derek arrived with an attorney I hadn't seen before, a younger man named Graff from a firm in Columbia. Brittany sat in the gallery, in a dark blazer, with the rigid posture of someone trying to appear unconcerned. Derek did not look at me when he came in. That told me something. The Moorfield couple, the buyers from Atlanta, were also present, with their attorney seated on the opposite side from Derek. They were a neat couple in their early 50s. The woman caught my eye briefly and gave me a look that contained no hostility, only the specific resignation of people who had discovered that the house they purchased did not, legally, belong to the man who sold it. Judge Sorrells opened the proceedings efficiently. Tom presented the motion to void the deed transfer. He submitted, in sequence, the original trust document naming me as sole trustee, the deed of transfer recorded 11 days ago, bearing a signature purporting to be mine as trustee, the notarization by Patricia Wynn, documentary evidence of Patricia Wynn's familial relationship to Brittany, Tom's own video recording of the 2019 trust signing meeting, and affidavits from Carol Whitmore, the contractor, and the HOA representative. It took Tom 14 minutes to present this material. He was calm and methodical. He didn't editorialize. Graff, Derek's attorney, rose and offered the defense argument. It was, as I had anticipated, built on two planks. First, that there had been a verbal authorization from me, that I had told Derek he could handle the property if financial circumstances required it, and second, a veiled suggestion that the trust document itself might have been signed under diminished understanding. Judge Sorrells let Graff finish. Then she looked at him with an expression I recognized from 30 years of watching people receive accurate information they didn't want. "Counsel," she said, "you are asserting a verbal authorization for a trustee to transfer trust real property. Are you aware of the statute of frauds?" Graff began to explain that verbal authorizations, the statute of frauds, Judge Sorrells said, slightly more precisely, requires that any transfer of real property be in writing. A verbal authorization, even if proven, which your evidence has not established, is legally insufficient to convey trust property. Is that the foundation of your defense? The silence from Graff's table lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a very long time in a courtroom. Tom passed me a note. It said, "That's it." Graff pivoted, gamely, to the capacity argument. Judge Sorrells asked to see any medical or psychological evidence supporting a claim of diminished capacity in 2019. Graff had none, because there was none. He mentioned the possibility of obtaining expert testimony. Tom then asked permission to play the recording of the 2019 trust meeting. The judge granted it. The courtroom listened to 47 minutes of audio and partial video. A woman, clearly and precisely, asking her attorney to explain the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust, questioning the implications of her son not being named as trustee, asking whether a future trustee could be designated in case of her own incapacity, and finally, in her own clear voice, confirming that she understood all documents before signing. That woman in the recording was me at 65. She sounded exactly like me now. When it finished, Judge Sorrells looked at Graff again. He said carefully that they would not be pursuing the capacity argument further. Then something happened that Tom had not fully predicted. Judge Sorrells looked directly at Derek. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "you signed a deed as trustee of a trust in which you hold no position of authority. You submitted that deed for recording. Can you explain to the court the basis on which you believed you had that authority?" Derek's attorney put a hand on his arm. Derek shook it off. And then Derek Callahan, my son, who had spent 42 years talking his way through everything, opened his mouth. "The property was always going to be mine eventually," he said. "She's 68. It was going to come to me. I needed it now." The room was very quiet. Tom wrote on his notepad. He just said the quiet part out loud. I looked at my son across the courtroom. He looked back at me finally. And in his face I saw, for the first time, not cunning or charm or the performed remorse he'd deployed on my porch. I saw the actual shape of what he had believed about me all along. That I was a temporary condition. That I was an asset waiting for transfer. That my decades of careful work had been, in his mind, always his money in someone else's account. It was the saddest thing I had seen in 11 years. The last thing sadder had been Roy's face in the hospital room. Judge Sorrells voided the deed transfer. She found the transfer fraudulent and without legal authority. She referred the matter formally to the county prosecutor's office and to the AG's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. She ordered Derek to produce all financial records related to the sale within 10 days. She also said, before adjourning, that the court had rarely seen a case in which the documentary evidence was more straightforwardly dispositive. She said this without looking at Graff, but Graff appeared to feel it anyway. The criminal process moved with a deliberateness I had not expected. Sandra Pryor at the AG's office had told me that fraud cases often moved slowly, stalled in paperwork, collapsed under the weight of their own complexity. This one did not. What helped was Derek's statement in the courtroom. Tom told me afterward that a person's candid admission in a recorded proceeding before a judge that they had transferred property because it was going to be mine eventually effectively closed the question of criminal intent. Intent is often the hardest element to prove in fraud cases. Derek had provided it, unprompted, to a courtroom full of witnesses. The Charleston County prosecutor filed charges 6 weeks after the hearing. Derek was charged with deed fraud, title fraud, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, the last charge carrying, under South Carolina law, a sentence of up to 10 years. Brittany was charged separately as an accessory based on her coordination with Patricia Wynn and evidence from bank records that showed the sale proceeds. $340,000, a discounted sale price Derek had arranged in his panic, had flowed through an account held jointly by Derek and Brittany before being partially dispersed to various creditors. Patricia Wynn cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. She provided a detailed account of how Derek had approached her, what he had told her about my agreement to the sale, and how she had notarized the document knowing I had not appeared before her. Her testimony was devastating to Derek's remaining defense. The civil recovery ran parallel to the criminal case. The Moorfield couple, who were innocent purchasers, had their own damages claim against Derek for the failed sale. A court-ordered accounting found that Derek had received $218,000 after the deal costs and his immediate debt payments. Money that had moved through 4 accounts in 11 days. The forensic accountant Tom hired traced every transaction. The Buick recovery was simpler. The young man in Somerville who had bought the car had no idea it was not Derek's to sell. Under South Carolina law, a fraudulent transfer of titled property voids the sale. The man received his $14,000 back from Derek's seized assets, and my car was returned to me. Somewhat dirty from 11 weeks of a 24-year-old's custody, but structurally sound. I drove my Buick home from Somerville on a cold December afternoon. I stopped at the Sullivan's Island Bridge and looked at the water. The same water Roy and I used to look at from the cottage porch, drinking coffee in the early mornings, not saying very much because we didn't need to. The cottage was mine again. The deed void had held. The legal title had been returned to the trust without complication. There was some work needed. Derek and Brittany had clearly used the property carelessly during those months, but Carol Whitmore had kept an eye on it, and the structure was sound. I sat on the bridge overlook for about 10 minutes. A pelican landed on the railing nearby and regarded me with magnificent indifference. Derek pleaded guilty in March. His attorney had apparently advised him correctly that going to trial against the recording and Patricia Wynn's testimony and his own courtroom statement was not a survivable strategy. He received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2, conditional on full financial restitution. The restitution order covered the original sale price gap and legal costs. Brittany's case resolved separately. She received 18 months of supervised probation and community service, a result that reflected her cooperation with the prosecution and the argument that her primary role had been facilitation rather than origination. She did not go to prison. I am not sure how I feel about that. I have decided that the criminal justice system is not required to satisfy my feelings, only to approximate justice, which it did reasonably well in this case. I did not attend the sentencing hearing for Derek. Tom offered to accompany me. I thought about it for a full week. In the end, I decided that watching my son receive his sentence was not something I needed to witness in order to be finished with it. I knew the outcome by phone before noon that day. When Tom called me with the sentence, I was in the Sullivan's Island cottage. I had driven out that morning to begin assessing what needed repair. I was standing in the kitchen, the small kitchen with the yellow curtains I had put up in 1994, when my phone rang. I said thank you. I hung up. I looked out the window at the water. Then I made a list of what the cottage needed. New paint on the porch railing, 2 windows with cracked sealant. The outdoor shower drain was blocked. A section of the garden fence had come loose. None of it was beyond fixing. None of it was beyond me. The spring after Derek's sentencing was the best spring I could remember in years. That might sound strange, given everything. But there is a particular relief that comes after a long period of sustained tension. A quality of air and light that you had forgotten was available to you. I hired a contractor named Marcus Webb, who had been recommended by Carol Whitmore, to do the repairs on the Sullivan's Island cottage. He was 60, careful with wood, and had strong opinions about the right primer for coastal conditions. We spent 3 weeks working through the repair list, and by April, the cottage looked better than it had in years. I replaced the yellow kitchen curtains, they had been faded and slightly salt damaged, with new ones in a blue-green that matched the color of the water on clear days. I did not rent the cottage. For a while I had considered it. The income would have been comfortable. But I decided that the cottage was not a financial instrument. It was a place Roy and I had loved, and I was going to use it accordingly. I went out on weekends in the warm months. I had Diane and her sister out in June, and we sat on the repaired porch and ate shrimp from the market and watched the light change over the water. Tom Hargrove updated my estate documents comprehensively. The trust was amended to include additional layers of clarity and a corporate co-trustee arrangement, a local bank's trust department, that would make any future unauthorized action essentially impossible. My will was revised. I added a provision that made charitable organizations, rather than any individual family member, the residual beneficiaries of the trust in the event of what Tom delicately called contested circumstances. I found in going through this process that I felt no bitterness about it, only the clean satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Sandra Pryor from the AG's office asked if I would be willing to speak with other elderly women who had experienced financial exploitation by family members. I said yes. I spoke to 3 women over the following months. On the phone, mostly, because 2 of them were not mobile. What I told them, each time, was the same thing. Document everything, trust your attorney, and do not mistake love for obligation. You can love someone and still hold them accountable for what they have done. Diane said I should write a book. I told her I had enough to do. Carol Whitmore and I became closer friends in that period. She had been a paralegal for 30 years and had seen a great deal of what people will do to other people for money, and she had the particular warmth of someone who has seen the worst and not been ruined by it. We walked the island most Saturday mornings when the weather allowed. It was a good routine. As for Derek, he served 14 months before being granted parole on the conditions set by the court. He was released in May of the second year. I knew this because Tom's office tracked it. I needed to know for my own security, not for any other reason. Derek did not contact me after his release. I don't know whether that was the condition of his parole or his own decision. Either way, I was not contacted, and I did not reach out. Brittany had filed for divorce while Derek was still incarcerated. That surprised some people, but it did not surprise me. Brittany had always been practical in the way that some people are practical. Not principled, but calibrated. Being married to a convicted felon on a restitution order was not a calculation that worked for her. She moved back to her family in Georgia. I have no information about her subsequent life, and I have not sought any. Derek, on the last report I received, was working a labor job in Colombia and living in a rented room. He was meeting his restitution payments minimally, which extended the repayment timeline, but technically kept him in compliance with his parole conditions. His business career, such as it had been, was over. No contractor would extend him credit, no partner would engage with him, and his name in the financial world was associated with a public fraud conviction. I thought about him sometimes. Not with anger, after a while. With something more like sorrow. The sorrow of understanding exactly how someone went wrong and knowing that understanding doesn't fix them. Derek had looked at a 68-year-old woman who had worked her entire life and had seen an asset. He had looked at his father's name and his father's effort and had seen an opportunity. That was a poverty of character that no court order could remedy. But it was not my poverty, and it was not my responsibility to carry it any further than I already had. The summer was warm. The cottage windows were closed against the heat most afternoons and open at night to catch the breeze off the water. I read through most of the library's collection on coastal plant species and replanted the cottage garden with things that could survive the salt air: sea oats, beach roses, native grasses. Roy would have approved. He had always preferred plants that were honest about what they needed. In September, almost exactly a year after I had come home to an empty driveway and my son's laughter, I drove my clean Buick to Sullivan's Island, made coffee, and sat on the porch in the early morning light. The mockingbird was back. Or another one. They're impossible to distinguish, which I have always liked about them. It sang for a while, and I listened, and the water was there, exactly as it had always been, and the morning was quiet, and mine. What did I learn? Document everything, trust your instincts, and never confuse love with obligation. You can love someone fully and still hold them accountable. Derek saw an old woman and thought he saw an easy target. He forgot that quiet people keep records. The cottage is mine. The Buick is in my driveway. the mockingbird still sings. If someone is slowly taking what is yours, don't wait. Act while you still can. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Thank you for listening. This was Peggy Callahan.